now my pleasure to introduce our second plenary speaker. Carissa Dwiwardani is professor of psychology at Biola University and editor-in-chief for the Journal of Psychology and Theology. She is board certified in clinical psychology and is licensed to practice as a psychologist in California and Virginia. She obtained her PhD in clinical psychology at Biola University. Her clinical internship was completed at the National Asian American Psychology Training Center in San Francisco, which is APA accredited, and focused on the intersection of cultural and psychological well-being. Her experience in higher ed includes serving as the director of Regent University's PsyD Training Clinic, the Psychological Services Center from 2013 to 18, where she was actively involved in the Association for Psychology Training Clinics. She has been awarded the William L. Hathaway Outstanding Faculty Award at Regent University and was a Multicultural Concern Scholar for APA Division 39. In her 10+ years in higher ed, she has taught graduate courses including diagnosis and treatment planning, psychodynamic therapy, ethics, multicultural psychology, among others. She has published in peer-reviewed journals and presented at national and international conferences in the areas of positive psychology, Christian integration, and multicultural psychology, and is the co-author of a book by IVP academic, The Integration Journey, A Student's Guide to Faith, Culture, and Psychology. Please welcome Carissa.
Hello, everyone. It is such an honor to be here. And in the short time that I've been here this morning, I've already feel so blessed. And just in the short conversations I've had with people here, feel so moved by our shared concerns and commitment to serving our communities well. And now I'm in a somewhat awkward position of correcting the conference organizer on how to say my name. That's okay. It's Carissa Dwiwardani is my name. My talk is titled Spiritual Formation in the Spaces in Between, Liminality and Relational Wholeness in a Fallen World. And as I start, I'd like to share an illustration called Schopenhauer's Porcupines. A troop of porcupines is milling about on a cold winter's day. In order to keep from freezing, the animals move closer together. Just as they are close enough to huddle, however, they start to poke each other with their quills. In order to stop the pain, they spread out, lose the advantage of commingling, and again begin to shiver. This sends them back in search of each other, and the cycle repeats as they struggle to find a comfortable distance between entanglement and freezing. This metaphor illustrates the dilemma of human relationships, that in some ways, all of us are constantly navigating through the ebb and flow of human intimacy with those we have enduring relationships with. As we think about this porcupine dilemma of relationships, the porcupines are described to go through this dynamic of coming together, withdrawing, coming together again, and so forth. But as we think about our society, we see a recent trend of us drawing away from each other. In fact, the Surgeon General, Dr. Vivek Murthy, calls our attention to the increasing rate of loneliness and isolation and social disconnection, calling it an epidemic and a public health crisis. This is a trend that has begun before the COVID-19 pandemic that has persisted since. In addition, we see estrangements becoming more and more common. Carl Pillemer, the author of a book called Fault Lines, conducted a survey with 1,300 people and estimated that 27% of American adults are estranged from their families, with 10% estranged from a parent or a child, 8% from a sibling, and 9% from an extended family member. In addition, people stop talking to friends and family over political differences. In 2018, a New York Times article states that since the 2016 election, nearly 1/3 of people have stopped talking to a friend or family member over political disagreements. So whether it be complete alienation or the general thinning of our social fabric, it is clear that our relationships come with dilemmas. Because of politics or other things, we prick each other with our quills. And we're finding it harder and harder harder within our social-political climate to coexist with each other. The porcupine illustration normalizes that human relationships involve an inherent dilemma. There is no relationship in this fallen world that, if we get close enough, does not involve any conflict or tension. We live as people who are redeemed, who are awaiting the fulfillment of the restoration of all things as they were created and designed to be. So in our relationships, we live on the realities of being pricked or hurt while we hold on to the promise of full restoration of shalom one day. As we reflect on our own stories of relational dilemma, I can think back to so many conversations with my Asian Americans friends, family, students, colleagues, and clients. We can see how some of these relational strains and challenges are amplified or triggered by life transitions. I imagine you all have had experiences in your own life and among the people you work with where this is the case, where life transitions change relationships. It spans from things like making career choices, such as making a decision to go into ministry. And maybe parents didn't approve it, and that caused a strain in their relationships, and in some cases, estrangements. Or dating or choosing a spouse, where families don't approve because of a variety of reasons. And then there being secrets and distance that occurs among family members because of this. Changes in family roles is another example of a transition. Having a child adds stress to a marriage, and sometimes couples experience a decline in their marital satisfaction following a transition to parenthood. Having a child also impacts social relationships. When I talk to people who are expecting their first child, their first children, they often worry about what relationships would look like with their own parents or their in-laws as they manage different expectations of child rearing. And people also go through changes in their faith journey, whether it be experiencing God in a different way, in new, deeper ways, or revising old beliefs. And when it involves a change in major ways, such as leaving the faith or leaving a particular church for a variety of reasons, it can create tensions in relationships. I have talked to families who have left a particular church because their small church doesn't have the kinds of kids ministry that they want to see for their kids. And so they leave the church. But still, depending on their involvement in the church or the roles they have in ministry, this could cause tensions and amplified relational dilemmas. These are just some examples of how transitions may often come with an intensification of relational struggles. I think of these transitional phases in our lives as liminal spaces. The word liminal comes from the Latin word that means threshold. When we find ourselves in these transitional spaces, we may find that our social landscape changes and our relationships also go through their own transitions. In my work as a therapist, professor, and researcher, I tend to be influenced quite a bit by Martine Laroche's framework of cultural psychotherapy. Whenever I consider an issue, whether it be in clinical work or in research, I tend to think about it in the multiple layers that are presented here. So the focus of my talk is primarily on relationships, but relationships exist alongside individual and contextual factors. Our relationships impact and are impacted by our individual factors, such as personality, preferences, and mental health. And our relationships, all of our relationships, exist within contexts. They're impacted by larger social-political factors, social-cultural factors, such as social-political events, economic, and historical forces. For Asian Americans, and I will go through them in the second section of my talk, these contextual factors involve racialization, migration, and in some cases, intergenerational trauma, which includes colonial legacies. So this is the outline of my talk today. I will be talking about relational struggles and how we might move toward relational wholeness in this fallen world. I plan to highlight these three main areas: individual factors impacting relational dilemma, Asian American contexts impacting relational dilemma, and Holy Saturday as a framework for spiritual formation and navigating relational dilemmas. I will begin by addressing individual factors. One lens that I find helpful in naming and labeling our own particular expression of navigating relational dilemma is to reflect on our attachment filters. This is just one framework out of many that can help us to think about how each of us might deal differently when we're faced with relational stress. Some of us are more inclined to withdraw when we sense some sort of tension or when we feel hurt. Some of us might find ourselves preoccupied with this relational stress, and it takes up our thinking throughout the day, and it's difficult to focus on other things. And you can see how when two people have different attachment filters and may want to deal with tension in different ways, this may in and of itself add more tension. So how do we end up with different attachment filters? One of the factors that impacts our attachment filters is our early relationships. And this shapes the way we expect and experience relationships with others, God, and ourselves. So people who have secure attachment feel safe, loved, and connected. They trust others and are comfortable with closeness while maintaining a sense of connection with their own emotions. In other words, secure people feel comfortable in relationships, but also have a good sense of what they think and feel, and can connect authentically with themselves and others. People with anxious attachment tend to be preoccupied with whether or not they are good enough in their relationships. They fear being abandoned and unloved, and they may seek constant reassurance and worry constantly about being good enough. People with avoidant attachment may fear dependence on others. And this could be due to past disappointments. This could be discomfort with intimacy. They prefer self-reliance and often struggle with emotional intimacy. And people with disorganized attachment sort of have the worst of both worlds of avoidant and anxious attachments. They experience a mix of fear and longing for connection. They may struggle with trust and feel conflicted about closeness. They may alternate between seeking God intensely and seeking attachment with others intensely, and then pulling away, feeling both drawn to and fearful of relationships. So I must clarify that the data shows that the majority of people have secure attachment styles. So most of us would fall under this domain right here. That's a secure. So if you imagine there being a scatter plot, most of us would fall in the secure domain. Okay? But all of us have tendencies. So some of us might fall on the dot that is in the secure domain, but might be closer to anxious, or might be in the secure domain, but might be closer to avoidant. And so, especially in closer relationships or more stressful situations, our attachment styles or tendencies might be more activated in those moments. A related concept to attachment styles is the idea of rupture and repair. Going back to the porcupine illustration, it's normal for relationships to go through moments of tension, hurts, and disconnection. In a secure relationships, ruptures are followed by repairs. And so, and in the cycle of rupture and repair over time shapes an expectation that ruptures in relationships can be tolerated because there will be repair. So what do I mean by repair? So much of attachment research has primarily been focused on infant-parent interactions and mostly infant-mother interactions. One of the focus in attachment research is emotional attunement. That when a baby is experiencing emotion, right, it's important for the parent to respond with warmth and empathy. But Attachment literature is also clear in saying that there's no such thing as a perfect parent. None of us could be 100% attuned 100% of the time. And so what attachment literature talks about is we need to aim to become good enough parents instead of being perfect parents. And so who are the good enough parents? So attachment research talks about how the good enough parents are the parents who, of course, provide safety and is generally dedicated to being attuned and provide a general sort of emotional and physical safety for the baby. But that a good enough parent, what differentiates a parent who is good enough, those who are not good enough, is sort of a good enough parenting includes repairing ruptures. So in the infant attachment research, this scenario might look like this. A baby who has been fed and is in a safe place, such as in a crib, who then poops and now has a dirty diaper. So the baby cries for the mother, but the mother can't get to the baby right away because, say, she's cooking or another child fell and now needs a Band-Aid. Meanwhile, the baby is even more upset because the mother is not responding. And so the baby is crying even more. So according to the attachment literature, what repair looks like in this moment is for a mother to say, "Oh my goodness, you have been waiting for me, and you are so upset that I didn't come when you called me." And the mother picks up the baby and say, "Thank you for being patient. Let's go change right now." So what are the components of repair? Repair is an interactive process in which rupture is recognized, reconnection is established, and attunement and resonance are experienced as a soothing process that enables the relationship to continue on a supportive path. So there is recognition of the rupture, an attempt at reconnection, and a soothing of the distress, of the emotional distress that's experienced. This concept has been applied to adult relationships, such as in couples relationships, that couples need to learn how to practice the cycle of repairing ruptures to deepen their bond. In fact, research on couples relationships show that it's not so much how often you fight or what you fight about that predicts the success of a relationship. It's how you repair after a fight. In fact, repairing ruptures has the potential to deepen the bond of a relationship. It's also important to note that repair is not about undoing the hurt. It's much more about acknowledging and reconnecting following the hurt. So keeping in mind that most people have secure attachment but have tendencies toward anxious, avoidant, or disorganized attachment styles, what are your inclinations when facing relational struggles? Do you tend to withdraw or be preoccupied with reassurance, or are you comfortable navigating relational tensions? What have you seen in your family or community on how ruptures are repaired? What are some effective ways that relational repairs have been modeled for you? So even when thinking about our individual factors, it's important to remember that all of us exist within a context. As you reflect on your attachment styles, I don't want your takeaway to be, "Oh, it's just my attachment style. It's a me problem." There's a context in which these things are formed and reinforced. So now I'd like to turn to contextual factors that may impact our relational dilemma as Asian Americans. But before I do that, I'd like to tell you a brief story. One of the activities I enjoy doing for my exercise is swimming. And I go to a local gym where each lane can be reserved for up to 2 people. So you would have half of the lane to swim your laps, which is manageable, but these lanes are created for 1 person. So it gets pretty tight. So you have to be mindful of not running into the divider. And in fact, I've gotten kicked on the shoulder by a guy I was sharing a lane with. The day after Christmas, I went to swim, and as you would expect, the pool was pretty slow. It was pretty slow that day. And I started to swim on my half of the lane as usual. And then I realized about 45 minutes into my swim that no one else was sharing the lane with me the whole time. And I could likely safely swim more towards the middle and simply adjust if someone does show up. So I was restricting myself to a tighter space without needing to. I am using this illustration to introduce a concept that sometimes we use in therapy, which is degrees of freedom. It is the extent to which we can be authentic with our needs, emotions, in our relationships, whether it be with ourselves, with a therapist, with loved ones, or with God. What I was doing that morning was I was restricting my degrees of freedom when I could have been more free in our swimming. Our attachment filters, as we discussed, influence the degrees of freedom we experience in our relationships. Some of us with more anxious attachment tendencies might find ourselves limited in the way that we authentically show up in our relationships because we are preoccupied by how they see us, whether we're good enough or not. Some of us who have avoidant tendencies might miss out on the freedom, grace, and intimacy that is available to us in our relationships because we tend to avoid them. So what I'd like to invite you to kind of reflect on is some of the contextual factors that may make us more restricted in the way that we show up in our relationships, in our degrees of freedom. Right? And so as I go through the different factors in Asian American context, I'm going to be linking all of them to how they impact our authenticity, our degrees of authenticity in showing up in our relationship. So these are the four factors that I will be talking about. I'll be going through them pretty quickly in the interest of time, but they are migration, racialization, intergenerational trauma, colonial history, and reality. So I don't know how many of you have seen the movie Past Lives, but I myself was very moved by that movie. I found that that movie was a really beautiful description of the impact of migration on our psyche and our relationships. And to me, the movie wasn't so much about a love story. The love story was more of a commentary on our relationships with our context and our identity and the people that we're connected with. So migration involves both tangible and intangible losses. There are things left behind and things that are hoped for in the new land. And the process of migration often involves the need to suppress a number of needs, wishes, and even cultural values for the hope of attaining new goals. I came to the United States from Jakarta, Indonesia, when I was 18 to pursue college education here. I said goodbye to my closest friends and family at the airport when I left, and there were many things that I did carry with me that were intangible, such as what informed my sense of self and identity, expectations of friendships, social interactions, and reliance on community. All of these things I had to slowly give up in order to navigate and make it in this new home country. A part of what this looked like for me was all of a sudden, I had to figure everything out completely on my own. My parents and friends were there to support me, advise me, and guide me the best way they could. But there were many things they didn't know how to navigate in my new context. So I had to figure it out. As I reflect on my own story, after coming to the US, I became very accustomed to being independent. I would say I even take pride in being independent. But God also created us to be in community. So there are spaces in which I'm also learning to invite others in, where I could experience more degrees of freedom in inviting others in and figuring it out together. For some of you, it may be that migration is not a part of your direct experience, but maybe your parents or your grandparents experienced migration and some of these ethos in the way that we learn to figure it out on ourselves, being independent, not rely too much on other people, may be impacted and transferred to you in the way that you navigate your day-to-day life and relationships. The next factor is racialization. Racialization limits the full expression of our identity and the fullness of who God has created us to be. Consistently being asked, where are you from? No, where are you really from? It's just one example of the many ways that Asian Americans are often made to feel as a perpetual foreigner. Maybe even wondering, do I belong here? Is it okay to be here and be fully who I am? And worse, to be subjected to violence, as we saw in the anti-Asian hate that rose during the COVID-19 pandemic. All of these racialized experiences, from being othered, being a perpetual foreigner, being subjected to stereotypes, limits the full expressions of our identity, needs, and emotions, and maybe even make us reject or want to suppress the fullness of who we are. This also comes in the form of stereotypes. One of the impacts that I think this has is it imposes a narrative of who we are that comes from an external racialized structure. As I mentioned, I came to the United States when I was 18, and I remember encountering this idea, it was many years ago, in the US, that Asians, especially Asian females, tend to be quiet and shy and withdrawn. It was such a strange experience because the narrative was so dominant and taken for granted that I almost was inclined to believe and even internalize it. But growing up with Asians pretty much all around me, I of course had friends and family members who were quiet and shy, but most of the girls and women I knew were actually quite loud when they talk and laugh, and assertive and bold. And I think that's a part of the minority stress, that when you are subjected to stereotypes, there's a narrative that is more narrow that's imposed upon us. We don't get to we tend to question then our own experience of the fullness of the expression of personalities and differences and diversity that exists within our community. So living in a racialized reality can cause us to question what we know about our identity and community, and cause us to live out of disintegration instead of an integrated sense of self. Stereotypes can also have the effects of restricting the ways that we show up to ourselves and others, narrowing the expressions of our personality, experiences, needs, and desires. So what are some of the experiences of migration that have impacted you, either directly or indirectly through your families or ancestors? What are some experiences of racialization that makes it difficult for you to show up authentically to yourself, to your loved ones, or to God? So now I will turn to intergenerational trauma. So first, I want to say that that trauma, unfortunately, and I think this is a part of our existence in a fallen world, is that trauma is common. It impacts, the most cited statistics say that 50 to 70% of us have been exposed to trauma. And the definition of trauma also includes not just harm that we directly experience ourselves, but knowing that that harm has happened to our community and to our loved ones. So many immigrants left their home country due to war, extreme poverty, and persecution. And even if they did not, their parents and grandparents often experienced these types of trauma. Families who generations ago experienced traumatic upheaval from war, oppression, and racism, natural disasters, and other events may experience various effects and enactments of the trauma passed on from the parent to child. So I'm going to start by talking about common reactions to trauma. This is not an exhaustive list of trauma symptoms, and please don't use this to diagnose yourselves or others in your life. This is just a part of the trauma response, part of the trauma symptoms. And there could be many reasons why people exhibit these behaviors or mood, not just trauma. So diagnosis should be done by a licensed mental health professional in the context of a thorough clinical interview. Okay, that's my disclaimer. But my hope in shedding light on this is to help provide more context in which trauma in our history could impact our community and in ways that silently get passed on to the next generations. So here are some trauma reactions. Fears and hypervigilance. So constantly scanning our environment to look for the possibility of danger. Constantly looking to our relationships for the possibility of danger. Constantly feeling fearful. And the second one is negative cognitions and mood, which includes expecting the worst, having negative views of self and others, and persistently feeling down or low. Okay. So first of all, these reactions to trauma are not necessarily pathological. You can imagine if you live in a crisis or in a war zone where danger is constantly right around you, that these reactions are actually adaptive. They help you make it, they help you adapt and survive. It's more that when you're in a safe situation, you're out of the trauma context, and we're still living as if we are in the trauma. That's when that it limits our full expression of who we are. That's where it limits our degrees of freedom. But you can see, right, how if you are living in danger, that having fear and hypervigilance is helpful. You do need to scan your environment for the possible of danger. And you do need to have negative cognition in expecting the worst. And it makes sense to have a negative mood if we're living in danger. Persistent avoidance is another symptom, right? So avoiding talking about or thinking about anything that has to do with the trauma or the context around it. So this might involve avoidance of certain people, places, or things, silence or taboo around certain topics. The last one I'd like to cover today is hyperarousal and hypoarousal. Hyperarousal means being particularly reactive. Again, if we're living in danger, it makes sense to be reactive, right? You wanna be attuned to the possibility of danger so that you can react quickly and run. And hypoarousal, I'm gonna show this graph right here. Hypoarousal is when you feel spacey, zoned out, numb, or frozen. Okay, and so this is kind of a part of the fight or flight and freeze response to stress. So what I'd like to highlight is this idea of the window of tolerance, that when we're living in danger, when we're concerned about survival, our window of tolerance, it goes down. It becomes more limited because we're focused on survival. And so we need even sort of a low trigger would trigger arousal, would trigger kind of reactivity, because we need to act, we need to make it, we need to survive. And so this window of tolerance, right, becomes shrunk when we are constantly in danger. I think a part of reactions to trauma is that we carry this reaction even when we're out of the danger. Okay. And so that is where the healing needs to happen. In therapy, right, we help client process through the trauma and differentiate between safe context and unsafe context, and start to open up little by little more degrees of freedom in which they can function and can be more authentic in safe situations. So one of the most well-known studies that looked into the transgenerational transmission of trauma was conducted by Rachel Yehuda and her colleagues on Holocaust survivors. They found that there were genetic markers of the effects of trauma that showed up on the next generation, even the adult children who were not exposed to the Holocaust themselves. So again, this mechanism, right, of transmitting the effects of trauma genetically is actually a protective mechanism, meaning it can help us prepare for the traumas that our parents experienced. Right? So, but right, again, when the situation, when the context has changed, then the reactions and the symptoms also need to go through their healing. So the good news is that healing is also intergenerational. All of us are empowered and have the capacity to start to make small changes, right, within ourselves that can get passed down to our children and grandchildren, or to our community, to our nephews and nieces. And so, I think it's important that we start to think about, right, what are some ways in which we want to be a part of this process of making things just a little bit better for the next generation. So a part of this intergenerational trauma is also a colonial history that impacts many countries. Indonesia itself was colonized by the Dutch for 3.5 centuries, and just gained its independence in 1945. So my grandmother lived through colonial times, and my mother was born on the year that we gained independence. So so a part of the strategy of a colonial system is a caste system. That there's a caste system between what's considered to be superior and what's considered to be inferior. And for me growing up, what gets passed down is sort of this idea that anything that's white is right. Anything that's European is superior. And whether it be called norms, whether it be mannerisms, how we eat is superior, right? That eating with fork and knife is superior than eating with our hands and banana leaves. And so cultural things like art, right? And so these things got passed down, right? And I remember growing up, my grandmother would always say, you should always know how to adapt. And there's, of course, a lot of good wisdom in this. We're talking about change and transition and being adaptable, knowing how to adapt to our circumstances is important. But the way I internalized it, maybe the way that somehow things were transmitted to me non-verbally, right, was that you always need to know how to adapt to power, to those who are in power. I remember talking about this with my therapist when I was in my 20s. There was something that was happening with a person in power that I didn't agree with. And I talked about how much, as much as I want to speak up, I felt that I needed to adapt to them because they were in power. Citing what my grandmother had said, my therapist, citing what my grandmother had said. My therapist in response said, if it was during colonial times, maybe you needed to adapt for your survival. But maybe that's not necessarily what works anymore now. And I think this is a part of the impact of intergenerational trauma, that during times of war, times of colonization, there were ways of being that worked for that time in order to survive and are now passed down to the next generations, even as context changes, and that may not work anymore. Another way in which colonization show up is even after formal colonization has ended, we still have internalized colonization, right? And as I mentioned earlier, this may show up in a sense of inferiority, that the ways of the colonizers are always better. What are some of the colonial histories or internalized colonialism in your story that impact the way you relate to yourself and others? In thinking about our relational dilemma, we have reflected on the ways that our context and individuality have been impacted by the fall. Imperfections, challenges, trauma mark all levels of this diagram. So how does our Christian faith speak to the fallenness of our relational realities? So in my own experience, Holy Saturday and Liminality has been helpful in my own process of relational struggles and transitions. I do want to say that I am not a theologian or a spiritual director. And so what I'm sharing today is from my own reflection of being in relational dilemmas in transitional spaces. The phrase transitional space or transitional zone is actually also used in architecture to describe spaces in between. It refers to things like staircases, hallways, or corridors. And usually these transitional spaces are just places that we go through without paying much attention to it. We're just thinking about where we're coming from or where we're going. Meanwhile, our relationships may be going through challenges. But we really don't have time to think about that, right? And I'm hoping today that we can all slow down and see where God may be meeting us right here in this transitional space, because these transitional spaces can also be transformative spaces. Maybe our reaction in learning about all of this that I'm covering today is to want to do something about it. I think there are definitely things you can do, but too quickly jumping into action for such a complex, multi-layered issue might shortcut some of the places in which God is wanting us to be spiritually formed in this place. The workshop leaders will also walk us through the unpacking of these considerations in deeper ways tomorrow. But for now, I'd like to introduce this framework of Holy Saturday as a way of thinking about spiritual formation in liminal spaces. I don't know how you typically celebrate Easter, but I grew up Presbyterian, and in my family growing up, we actually didn't celebrate Holy Saturday as much as Sangeeta might. In my family growing up, Easter was on our minds for weeks or months before the day itself. Right? My family, church, and community prepared ourselves in significant ways for Easter Sunday. It was curious to me that Good Friday, in many ways, received very little attention and preparation compared to Easter Sunday. For Good Friday, we would go to church for a Friday evening service, reflect on biblical passages and hymns with themes of Christ's death on the cross. We would leave service that day knowing that we would come back on Sunday for a festive celebration. Even more curious than the way my church prepared for Good Friday was its silence about the Saturday in between. In my family, we did not talk about the significance of that Saturday. And we just went about our day as if it was a normal Saturday, visiting grandparents or playing with friends. The Reverend Dr. Pamela Cooper White, in contrasting Holy Saturday to both Good Friday and Easter Sunday, states the following. Holy Saturday is different. It is quiet, not full of drama or big important music. It's the between that spans the agony of Good Friday and the overwhelming joy of Easter. We have hindsight that Jesus' family and friends did not have. We know that the story has a miraculous ending that no one could then foresee except Jesus himself. And on Thursday and Friday, even Jesus had his doubts and fears. However, we also perhaps need a little time to process all that has happened this past Holy Week, to digest the reality of Jesus' death. Yes, he really died. That wasn't just a magic show where the beautiful young woman appears to be sawed in half, but then rises out of the magician's box, and we know it was all just an illusion. Jesus really died, and if we believe in Jesus as the incarnation of God, we must also proclaim that God died there on that hideous Roman cross, an instrument of ingenious, sadistic, slow death. God's own self on Holy Saturday is dead, lying in a borrowed tomb. When I read the Reverend Dr. Cooper White's reflections a number of years ago, it was the first time I reflected on how Jesus' followers, his mother and siblings, must have felt on the day after his death. The shock, sorrow, disorientation, perhaps even numbness, and the question of now what? Jesus' followers did not know that Jesus was going to be resurrected the next day, and in between Friday and Sunday, they lived in grief and horror. And as they lament Jesus' death that day, as far as we could tell from the biblical account, God was silent. In fact, one of Jesus' last words were, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani. My God, why have you forsaken me? I don't know what transitional spaces you might be experiencing right now, but perhaps there has been a type of ending in your life, whether it be the death of a loved one, the end of a relationship, or a church split, marking the end of a community you've known for years, or maybe you're experiencing relational estrangement or alienation. Our Christian faith provides a space for us to process the pain and disorientation after a crisis. Holy Saturday represents a time where we sit with our complex or conflicting thoughts and feelings, as well as the pain and the injustice that we feel after a crisis. And we invite God to sit with us there. And we might invite others to sit with us in this space. Maybe you can imagine inviting God and a few people you trust on the steps of the stairs as you process the complex feelings you have in this transitional space. This brings us to an important takeaway from our Christian faith, namely that pain, grief, injustice, and crisis are not things that God overlooks or glosses over. Even though God created the world as good in the beginning, pain and grief is a reality we live in this in-between time of Jesus' first and second coming. We've reflected on relational dilemmas, including some of the contextual and individual factors that impact them, and how we might be spiritually formed in this space. When I was a sophomore in college, I took a statistics course in psychology. I still remember to this day the professor starting the class by saying that there is no split between the secular and the sacred, that all of life forms us spiritually, either toward Christ-likeness or away from Christ-likeness. So he encouraged us to reflect on how we could be spiritually formed in this statistics class. This is what he said. For some of you in the class, math might be difficult. And for some others of you, math might come very easily. So he went on to say that for some students, their spiritual formation task is to learn to be gracious and to help their peers. Whereas for others in the class, their formation task is to learn to ask for help, whether it be from peers or from the professor or TA. What I took away from this was that there's no one size fits all of what spiritual formation looks like in any given situation. It requires a deep knowledge of ourselves and a listening to the Holy Spirit's guidance to know what our spiritual formation task is at the moment. And I have, in the 20 plus years that I have passed since I took the statistics class, I find myself asking this question when I'm facing the dilemma of relationships in this fallen world. There are times in which I feel God inviting me to be quiet and to bring my lament to God. And in other times, it is to draw closer to the other person and try to go deeper in our relational dilemma. So my encouragement to all of us today, especially as we think about relationships in our lives that might be challenging, especially in liminal spaces, to think about what is your spiritual formation task in this space. So I'll close this talk, but encourage you to continue your processing as you talk with one another in this conference with some of these reflections. In the particularities of the distances and challenges in your relationship, what is your challenge to grow and be spiritually formed in this moment? Is it to tolerate someone's decision even if they don't align with yours and to manage your disappointments? Or is it to be vulnerable and ask for what you need or ask for help? Is it to initiate repair? Is it to be courageous in sharing your appreciation and gratitude, as well as honestly share why you might be leaving, say, from a church? Or is it to bring your lament to God in the Holy Saturday seasons of your life and experience Him meeting you there? All of these questions acknowledge the realities of our relationships in this fallen world. And in this talk, we've talked quite a bit about porcupines. But in the Bible, at least as far as I know, the Bible doesn't talk about porcupines. But in its prophecy about the coming of Messiah, Isaiah 11 does bring a picture of shalom, a complete restoration of peace and God's fullness in the way His people and creation relate to each other. Not just that the porcupines won't prick each other, but the wolf shall dwell with the lamb, the leopard shall lie down with the young goat, and the calf and the lion and the fattened calf together, and a little child shall lead them. They shall not hurt or destroy in all my holy mountain. For the earth shall be full of the knowledge of the Lord as the waters cover the sea. In that day, the root of Jesse, who shall stand as a signal for the people, of him shall the nations inquire, and his resting place shall be glorious.